Hello, ED531 colleagues. This is Tim. This is my submission for assignment 4A for our class looking at different populations on college campuses. For the purposes of this assignment, I chose to focus my attention on religion and spirituality on college campuses and looking at the dynamics that exist between students of different religions, different spiritual traditions, and the different backgrounds and historical contexts as to some of the barriers they may face, some of the challenges, some of the successes, and some of the things that as student affairs professionals we can put into place to ensure that these students, that all of our students, regardless of what their faith, tradition, or spirituality may be, that they all have an equal opportunity at our institutions. And then I'm also going to specifically, from my other sources, look at Muslim students a little bit more in depth, especially in light of some things that are going on in current events today with the new administration and some of the things that I think we need to keep in mind as student affairs professionals and as educators that some of these students may face. So starting out, I think it's important to think about historically what type of religious influences exist in higher education, specifically American higher education, what the roots of it are, how it manifests itself on our campuses, and look at some of the major progressions that have occurred over the course of history, and then think about what resources we can put into place to combat some of the things that may be some fundamental or systemic types of issues that may exist on our campuses. So thinking first about the religious influences on colleges and universities, it's important, I think, to understand just the foundation of American higher education is rooted in a Judeo-Christian background, especially looking at the first institutions in the United States or in the colonies. Predominantly, a lot of them were of a sort of neo-Protestant background, given the dynamic between the more Protestant settlers and the Catholic regime that ruled in England and subsequently over the colonies, and the influence that this had in developing the colleges and universities. So thinking about how it all began, it began thinking about how to educate the clergy. So the original colleges and universities in the colonies and in the United States following the Revolution were focused on training students in a Christian ministry, and all had some form of charter to educate the clergy, to create a clergy who were literate, clergy who could educate, and clergy who could sort of bring the message to the masses, and essentially spread the Christian beliefs and values into the greater society. So that's where we see the beginnings of higher education, and from the beginning they've had a religious tug on them. They've had religious influence from the beginning, and it isn't until in the coming into the 1800s, especially later 1800s, that we start to see the rise of non-religious institutions. So essentially, with the exception of maybe one or two institutions of the original 14 that were founded, which I believe was University of Philadelphia or the College of Philadelphia. The institutions all did have a religious undertone to them. So we start to see that by 1860 there are 14 permanent Catholic colleges that had already been established. Now, looking at that and just fast forwarding a little bit, by 1930 there are 126 Catholic colleges. So again, we're looking at this deeply rooted Christian tradition in higher education and what that means. So moving a little bit ahead into the impact it can have on our student bodies, when you look at institutions and really the foundation of higher education being rooted in a specific tradition, regardless of the separation of church and state and First Amendment rights and whatnot, there is still this Christian undertone to a lot of the practices that occur on college campuses, to a lot of the traditions, to a lot of plans and policies and things like that that are in place do have this Christian undertone to them. So it's important to consider that with the large influx of new, not new, but of diverse religious populations that we're seeing on our campuses today, that when a lot of what we do at our institutions and a lot of institutions have done from their founding has been rooted in sort of Christian principles and Christian background. So it's just something that I think we all really need to keep in mind. So when we think about these religious institutions, the big changes start to come when institutions become state institutions or have government influence versus being private entities. So the Morrill Act of 1862, which granted land grants essentially to states to create colleges and universities that focus on agriculture and mechanical arts and a more industrial education through a more industrial and agricultural lens, we start to see that states are now starting to create institutions and found institutions from a state charter versus whatever private entity it may be. And this is a major turn for higher education, because before that, as I said, you had this sort of Christian religious undertone to higher education, and now we're starting to see it become more state controlled and opening their doors a little bit more to different populations now, where some institutions prior had said we welcome others to learn of what we're teaching. It still was with the specific lens of the specific faith. So with the start of these new state-controlled entities, religion not having as much of a role, or on paper not having as much of a role, comes into play in terms of the dynamic that's existing on these campuses. Now, what's still important to recognize is, although these are state-controlled entities and not religious-controlled institutions, the majority of those who are in government at that time, by a vast majority, are white Christian men. So again, even though these are institutions of higher education that are state-funded or that are state entities, there is still a religious influence on them that continues even to this day. So even where we see this change and start to move into the creation of some of these state institutions, it is important to recognize that there is still a religious connection for a lot of them, and in the policies that we are seeing go on. What we also see at some of these different institutions, so we see a stray from religious control, we see religious centers start to arise on campuses. So these, again, it's tended to be predominantly Christian students, but there are Christian student organizations. There are Jewish student organizations. There are specific organizations within Christianity itself. So Catholic students, Protestant, Lutheran, Methodist, fill in the blank of whatever denomination of Christianity you're talking about. And even where at some of these institutions, there may not be a center, there are student organizations. So thinking about the Campus Ministry Association and organizations like that, that there are 955 college campuses that are served by campus ministers specifically from that organization. So thinking about that in context, this was how religious institutions and different faith organizations still kept themselves rooted in higher education by engaging students, not necessarily from a governance standpoint with religion, but through student groups. And that, again, continues to today on many campuses, and the majority of campuses, I would venture to say, especially now, we're starting to see, or we're continuing to see, student organizations for the majority of religions that exist. And what I think is an interesting dynamic in being a professional that works at a religious private institution are some of the perceptions that come along with that because of the affiliation of the institution itself, that some of these organizations are not able to happen. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that's something to keep in mind too, perceptions that come along with religious affiliated institutions versus non-religious affiliated institution. And then in addition to the student groups that are existing on campus and the religious centers, it's also community-based. So in the community, even if there is not necessarily a religious center or a group, the community engaging with the institution, whether it's a synagogue, a mosque, church, whatever it may be, and students having that opportunity as well and engaging in their religious studies in that way. when we think about student organizations, as I said, we have student organizations like Hillel, like Christian student organizations, that we have campus ministry organizations or departments themselves. We have Muslim student organizations and whatnot. But in some of our Greek organizations, even, there are religious influences as well. So so for example, Jewish faith, Zeta, Beta, Tau, Alpha, Epsilon, Phi, the first being the established fraternity, the latter being a sorority specifically geared toward Jewish students, and then the merging of some organizations specifically outlined in our text, Phi Kappa Theta and Theta Kappa Phi at Brown University, Lehigh University, respectively, where they're founded, merging together to have Greek letter organizations that do have a religious affiliation to it. So again, we're seeing the religious influence regardless of whether or not it's a state or religious controlled entity. I think now shifting into a dynamic that exists on campuses these days is the discussion of religious versus spiritual, and more, I think, having worked with several campus ministry entities, the thing that keeps coming up when discussing, what faiths are our students, or how religious or spiritual are our students, is the idea of I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, and what that really means. And I think that our text defines it well, but looking at religion, we're looking at defining religion as a specific affiliation with any religious group. Again, so I am Jewish, I am a Christian, I am a Protestant, I am a Muslim, whatever it may be. And spirituality is looking at it not through the lens of a specific denomination, but through value, through moral. So looking for answers, seeking out purpose wherever it may be, and not just through the lens of any specific religious organization. So on campuses today, I think it's really important to embrace this dynamic. There has been research done that our text outlines that talks about how the sort of students are still religious. They still identify with a specific religion. That over 60% still in some way say that they have that they regularly attend religious services and things like that. But there is also an increase in the number who identify as spiritual, while a decrease in the specific religious affiliation. So looking at that together again, we're seeing more of these students who are saying that I am spiritual, but I do not necessarily subscribe to a specific religion. So taking that into context, I think it's important that when we're looking at resources, that first we provide an open environment for students of whatever faith tradition, or who don't necessarily identify with a faith tradition specifically, but who are looking to find their spirituality. So I think that shifting into the conversation of resource and what we can do for our students to make sure, regardless of what their religion is, that they have the opportunities, that they feel comfortable, and they have the opportunity to express themselves, that we put these practices into place. So we talked about student organizations a little bit earlier, and the role that they play on campuses, and how they can be leveraged, I think, more so to not just for students of a specific faith, but to educate the rest of the student body and the community about their specific group, their specific beliefs, and in turn other organizations can do that and create this dialogue. I think students, when it comes to religion, is one of those topics, you hear people when they go to dinner, when they meet somebody new, you don't bring up politics, you don't bring up religion, because it is sort of can be uncomfortable. But I think as educators, there's an obligation that we have to have those discussions and to provide forums and venues for students to engage in these conversations with each other, as well as with the community as a whole, and develop a fundamental understanding of the different dynamics that exist between different religions, different faith traditions, and the similarities, I think, too, where there's a lot of, when we look at the core, the fundamental morals and values, it's a lot of the same type of themes. It's just a different take on, or a different cast of characters, if you will. One of the things that I've said to students in this kind of conversation is, there's a lot of repetition in terms of themes. It's just depending on who the hero or who wrote the book is, essentially. So that's something I think we can keep in mind too. I think campus ministry programming is critical, and I think it should be done in a secular way, while also not losing some of the the religious components to it, so there really is an opportunity to embrace faith and whatever it may be. And I also think as an institution that if our mission is dictating that we are welcoming of all faith traditions, that we need to think about that in terms of policy. Thinking about what's being taught in the classroom, thinking about the spin that's put on things, thinking of the days that we get off, the celebrations that we have, the certain things that we are programming for and not others, and thinking about whether it's intentional or not, the impact that that can have on our fellow students. So, for example, the idea of having a Christmas break or having Christmas off and doing a Christmas party at your institution, but not celebrating Hanukkah in some way, or not celebrating Ramadan, or whatever some of the other traditions may be. I think space is important too. Different religions have different traditions in terms of prayer, how often they have to do it, what type of space they need to use. So providing these types of forums and spaces where, regardless of your faith tradition, you have an opportunity to pray, you have an opportunity to reflect and not stray from whatever faith tradition you think is important simply because you think the institution is not comfortable for it. So think a sort of personal story within this. I had an interaction with a student earlier this year, and again, working at Caldwell University, a Dominican Catholic institution that has expressed that and been very intentional about saying we welcome all faith traditions. I had a Muslim student come in who said, I have an idea for student organizations. I know it's probably not possible, but I would like to, if there is any way to do this, start a Muslim student organization. That was simply because he thought because we were a Catholic institution that type of thing would not be embraced. And I was still taken aback by that, but the discussion was then absolutely you can. The institution is well, and just that type of message and sending the institution is welcoming. The institution is embracing of all faiths, whatever they may be, and want to provide an avenue for students to engage in these discussions and for students to celebrate their faith and share their faith, I think is pretty important. Looking at other sources, and I guess I mentioned earlier, specifically looking at current events in our Muslim student population. So the first source that I utilized was within the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was an article from January 31st of this year. It's entitled "How One University is Contending with the Aftermath of Trump's Travel Ban." Now, I'm not. Let me preface this by not putting a political spin on it, just simply looking at the impact from a religious standpoint as to what this has done on campus. So we're at West Virginia University, this is immediately following the travel ban of 7 Muslim countries and the hold on people being able to travel to and from these countries and the potential for detaining or people are sending back to these countries or whatever it may be. So at this institution, there was a candlelight vigil that was held from the institution, and then the Muslim Student Association at that campus at West Virginia University also did this vigil and also talked about some of the things that can be put in place so that these students could feel comforted. So thinking about Islamophobia, and now currently there's a lot of rhetoric out there that is anti-Islam, and thinking about the impact that can have on our students, and making sure that there is that these students are given resources and that they feel embraced by our institutions, regardless of what type of rhetoric may be out there, whether or not, again, not putting a political spin on this, but just from a moral standpoint. And if our mission is saying that we're embracing students of all faith traditions, that we really stand by that, especially during times where some of these specific populations may be persecuted. And the president of the institution did say that they, in light of the executive order, they obviously take it very seriously, but they're moving quickly to assist their students and faculty directly impacted. So I think it is important when something like this happens that, or even there's a potential of it, that we make sure as educators and as institutions of higher education that we look at what we can do for these students, not necessarily, what does this mean politically? What does this mean, for powers that be per se, but specifically what do we need to do for our students to make sure that they feel comfortable in light of what's going on? And along the same lines, I viewed a video, it was from December 1st of 2015 from Student Affairs Live, which is part of Higher Ed Live. And it was entitled, "Are We Supporting Muslim Students on Campuses?" And in this video, the woman Heather Shea Gasser from Michigan State University had a panel discussion with Ibu Patel, who is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Corps, and then also with 3 other student affairs professionals, Muslim student affairs professionals, one Maria Ahmed, Farhan Saeed, and Hamza Khan. And in viewing this video, there's a couple things that really stuck out to me. The first one is Mr. Patel identified 3 major themes that are impacting Muslim students on college campuses. The first one being Islamophobia, which I discussed before, and this undertone in that somehow that Muslim students are uncomfortable on campuses, especially with some of the rhetoric that's out there and things that are going on nationwide, and that there's this view that somehow Muslim students are less, or they're all terrorists, or whatever it may be. And whether this is not true, but the perception that's out there and how they're viewed by other students and by the institutions. He also identified a need for space, which I alluded to earlier, and establishing on campuses where Muslim students can go. They have to pray 5 times a day based on the religious text on the Quran and what their obligations are. So having that space available, and then to be able to embrace their identity openly. And this is true for any population. We've all discussed it in our various groups. I discussed it when I was talking about Native American students last time, but being able to really embrace their identity free from judgment, embrace their identity free from fear that somehow by identifying as Muslim that they are putting themselves in danger. And this is something I think, again, this is to consider with any faith tradition. Again, we're talking about Muslims now, but if there is a culture of fear or a stereotype of fear that where a specific group feels like they cannot practice their faith tradition or their spirituality for fear of judgment, then we're doing a disservice and potentially damaging these students and their experiences. And in this video as well, Miss Ahmed talked about that fear, and then also talked about specifically, which I thought was interesting, navigating it as a Muslim woman, which again, we're talking about subgroups within these religious organizations and specifically with the Muslim faith, how it is very sort of conservative in terms of the role of women and how they're perceived, and how just visually by wearing by wearing a scarf around their head or any of their attire or covering their bodies, that they're going to be judged, and the importance of educating students and educating the community about what the faith is, and this is why they do or dress how they do, or this is why a specific group engages in prayer the way that they do, or whatever it is. Again, so just thinking about the different practices that occur, and how as educators, especially in student affairs, we have an obligation, and I think more importantly an opportunity to provide these forums, provide these programmatic opportunities to educate our students, to leverage our student groups and fellow students to educate each other and create campus culture of acceptance for all faith traditions, and taking into consideration all the different facets of it that come into play, and making sure that they are equal for all faiths. Again, just because our higher education system is rooted in Christian ideals and Christian principles, that we now today have students of so many different faith traditions, or just who are just finding their faith or just finding their spirituality, the way that we have to be able to provide them all an equal opportunity to do that, whatever it is that they deem to be their faith or their spiritual affiliation of any kind. So that's a little bit about the dynamics of religion and spirituality. I welcome any questions and would love to chat any more with all of you, and look forward to reading all of your work as well. So till next time, be well all, and I will see you soon. Take care.